Dr. Dan Pardi stands at the intersection of cognitive science, wellness, and productivity as the CEO of humanOS.me, a comprehensive application designed to elevate both mental and physical performance. A distinguished researcher, he collaborates with renowned institutions like Stanford University in California and Leiden University in the Netherlands. His groundbreaking research focuses on unraveling the complex ways in which lifestyle factors, including sleep, exercise, and diet, impact cognitive functioning. In addition to his academic endeavors, Dr. Pardi is a sought after consultant for elite organizations and special forces. His portfolio includes collaboration with Silicon Valley powerhouses such as Mayfield Fund and Artis Ventures, as well as trailblazing companies like Pandora, Intuitive Surgical, and Jazz Pharmaceuticals. Furthermore, he contributes to the peak performance of the U.S. military special forces, working with groups like the Navy SEALs and the Green Berets to optimize mental acuity in high-stress environments. As the host of humanOS Radio and a prolific writer on blog.humanos.me, he disseminates actionable insights on sleep optimizations, biohacking, and lifestyle medicine, making frequent guest appearances on health and science podcasts to broaden public understanding of these critical topics. Dr. Pardi, I am so excited to have you here because that bio doesn't even do you justice. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation and I love the work you're doing. And I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today.
Absolutely. So, I mean, when I put this together, my biggest question really was, what is health? And I started researching, who are the experts in our field that really understand and can give us a definition of health? Because it sounds so simple, but it really isn't. And your name was at the top of the list of people who were really digging into this concept of what health is, because it's very often misunderstood or simplified. So how do you define health?
Yeah, so this question overall struck me a few years ago when we use the term regularly, often, everything in our field, we touch on it constantly. And yet the ability to define it or get a good definition that everybody agrees on, or that doesn't sound like what we'll call like a generality, that doesn't really have any teeth to it, was lacking. And so I started to think more on that subject. And it's really been years in the making, but I started to write and I started to do some presentations on the subject. But from a high level, before I dive into the definition, I think some of the issues relate to, if we think about anything, any sort of word meaning, it's in the field of lexical semantics, right? It is a branch of linguistics that is dealing with word meaning. And some concepts are really easy to encircle with meaning. Like it's not hard to say this is what this thing is very clearly. But some ideas are actually a lot harder to then create a really easy, simple definition for. So some of the challenges that you face is that you give something that is encompassing, but it's so broad that it is a generality and it almost doesn't mean anything. Like health is life and it's, something like that. It just wouldn't really grab you and it doesn't help. But then when you try to take a big concept and squeeze it into something that is ultimately a box that is too small, it's easy to criticize the parts that are missing outside of a more precise definition. Or you run into issues of tautology where you will define the term with the term itself, or even other synonyms that are used for that. And so with all of this is what we are dealing with health. And we end up with something called semantic uncertainty. And this is where different definitions or understandings occur, and it causes confusion in our world. So it's important to get it right too, right? Because we need to be able to have a common understanding so that there isn't necessarily competition between ideas or inefficiencies in operationalizing around the idea, or even marginalization of key pieces so that other dominant perspectives take over and key parts of the full definition are not considered when we actually are trying to turn this into systems that actually deliver health to the population. So those are all things that relate to the importance of getting this right. And I'll tell you that it's not something that is sitting before us that is easy to pluck out. In fact, we might never really be able to offer one crisp definition that everybody agrees on, that suffers no, criticisms that are reasonable. And that's because, again, this term is so vast, it's so big, it's so important. But the philosophy of exploring this idea is pretty fascinating. And just by talking about it, like we'll do today, you can get a totally different sense about what it means, and then hopefully how what it means for you and how to operationalize that in your own life, regardless of what systems are available for you in whatever area of the world that you live in from healthcare. So that's basically to kind of start off with the importance. But we can also talk some about the history of the idea too, if you're interested.
I would love that. Let's go there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So we've obviously this has been a key part of humanity for a long time. We understand when there's a very intuitive aspect of health, right? We get it when we're healthy or not fully healthy, and humans for all eternity have really understood that. Before, though, what we would attribute our health to was usually the will of the gods. So in antiquity, if you were sick, actually the health that you have was considered a gift from the god. And if you then were dealing with any sort of health issue, it was because that you have disturbed them in some way, disturbed or upset them in some way. And this then required types of offering in the forms of prayer or pilgrimage, sometimes even sacrifice, to hopefully appease them and get back into their good graces. So, for example, if you had really awful headaches, then it was considered that demons had entered into your body and were punishing you. And yeah, isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so for this lasted for a very long time, and slowly we started to make progress with certain Greek philosophers that really started to use the power of observation and extensive writing. So, for example, Galen was a key figure whose writings, and he did dissections mostly on animals, but sometimes on deceased humans, and wrote vastly on the subject. And he basically influenced it. We had a slight shifting at that point from simply bewilderment why something would happen and then having to appease the gods to say, okay, here are some actual things that are occurring within the body. And his writings persisted for about 1,000 years into about the early Renaissance, when we became a little bit more scientific. But it says a lot about just the older state and perspective of things. And a major figure in the Renaissance was a man named Paracelsus. And actually, I'll say one other thing too, because I find this is really interesting. One of the gods is the god Asclepius, who's the god of healing. And so, if you think of the rod of Asclepius now, it is the international symbol for medicine. It is the staff with a serpent wrapped around it. We probably all know that symbol. Yeah, and the main idea there is that we use that symbol in medicine as a reminder of our ancient beliefs and how we've evolved since then, and how this symbol of healing still is something that we utilize, but it's sort of an homage to former perspectives. Yeah.
That is fascinating. I mean, I know about the strap and I've seen it everywhere, but to just kind of bring it back to that, that's phenomenal. Um, so in your experience,
Yeah.
what are some of the misconceptions or misunderstandings that people have about health? And how can they address
Yes.
that and have a more accurate understanding as well?
Yeah. So, I would say that we started to make better progress. If you were to maybe summarize, we went from this bewilderment about why what occurred with health and when it was absent. And there's also sort of an interweaving of different ideas that health and medicine have always interweaved. So early ideas. So help is an old English term, over 1,000 years old, and it means to be full, to be whole. And then to heal somebody is the infinitive. To heal is to bring somebody back to wholeness. And so these ideas of health and medicine have always interwoven. Sometimes we would understand health by its absence. And that theme has been really important even in modern medicine today. Sometimes it is easier to understand what a big topic is by the absence of a key part of it. And then you can point to that more clearly and say, okay, so this now we see that health is lacking because there's a disease present or an illness or an injury. But anyhow, so certain philosophers, Galen, Socrates, Paracelsus, over time had made some incremental advancements. And eventually we had moved from more religious based ideology into slightly more scientific. Paracelsus is a sort of a fascinating character. He was a physician during the Renaissance period that traveled extensively throughout the Venetian Wars, and he really emphasized that the key to becoming a good physician was being somebody who had both education in natural sciences, so learning about what we knew about the body, at least at that time, but also having an empirical eye. And so I think that actually is relevant even to today. And the reverse almost is that just by learning academically and scientifically and what we can find from clinical studies, you want to be aware of what occurs at the current state of science. But the clinical observation will always remain relevant and a relevant and important input to understanding how to work with a particular individual. And so that's something we can kind of come back to and touch on. But essentially, that was the evolution, and eventually with the formation of the United Nations after World War II, that the purpose of the United Nations was bringing together countries to try to prevent another war from happening. So 51 countries met to form the United Nations in 1945, and they were committed to international peace, social progress, better living standards, human rights, things like that. But they were also committed to forming a global health organization. And that's where the World Health Organization came out of. And in their charter, they offered a definition of what health is. So health is not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, but also a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And that was now the first time, I think, that there was a collective global agreement on what health is, at least temporarily, because it did suffer from a lot of criticisms, and those criticisms were very important. And so, like, for example, some of the criticisms were that, who has complete physical, mental, and social well-being? Who can raise their hand and say, yeah, I'm complete, I've completed all of those. And as a result, it makes it feel like health is an unattainable state. So that was one of the criticisms as well. Or even that if you then attempted to be healthy, that would actually allow for one to attain some sort of lifespan that, have a great health span. So you have great health and you live as close to the maximal theoretical lifespan of about 125 years. But as we had more and more people living longer, we could see that was not true, and that there are many things that affect a person's health trajectory as we live into longer years. And of course, this is things like environment and lifestyle, and we have recent appreciation that those account for more than earlier conceptions, which was that genetics really determine how long we live. Of course, genes matter, but also things like birth time, when were you born, what were the conditions that you were born into, and even what was the average age of reproduction of your ancestors over the last several generations. Work by Michael Rose, a distinguished evolutionary biologist at UC Irvine, one of the top living evolutionary biologists today. In his work, he showed that if you actually shift over many generations the average age of reproduction in a population, it was done in fruit flies, but you could see that alone was able to extend lifespan. And you can say, well, how relevant is that to humans? And that's always a good question to ask when you're comparing to such distinct organism types. But we're really looking at how the genes do react to when pregnancy occurs, and so there's probably some likelihood that it applies to us as well. But yeah, there's also, what's really important is that there is a stochastic or random nature to aging and to health. And what that means is that, let's say you have two people they're the same age, they do CrossFit, they were born at the same time, they live comparable lifestyles, and one might come down with some sort of chronic issue, and it is not because they weren't doing things right, so to speak, but because of the random element um, of health and aging. The the human genome undergoes 1 million molecular lesions per cell per day just due to environmental causes and for normal metabolism. That's a lot of DNA damage that our DNA damage response is now required to clean up. And if that cleanup process is incomplete, or our cleanup machinery suffers damage over time, as it does in the aging process, then that will enable the likelihood that some random error could cause early morbidity or premature mortality. And so you have to take that into consideration when you're thinking about this complete state of social, physical, mental, and social well-being. In that it doesn't really seem practical, and that actually led to some new a new definition being offered by the World Health Organization in 1986. So about 40 years later, they said, okay, we're going to redo this again, and that actually was a much better definition. But I'll pause there for a second because I know I'm talking a lot.
Oh my gosh, no, this is so fascinating. I actually wanted to. So, was the last definition issued by the World Health Organization the one issued in 1986?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
what is your take on that? What is that definition, first of all, and what is your take on that definition?
Yeah. So this definition is one that I am actually very favorable towards. And
Okay.
it shifts the emphasis of health towards the ability to adapt and self manage in the face of social, physical, and emotional challenges, right? All the challenges that we face in the process of being alive, being a human. And then this is a kind of echoes on this comment of resilience, which is defined as the capacity of populations or individuals to endure, adapt, or generate new ways of thinking, or generate new ways of functioning. And that is so true in today's world where we're dealing with so much change in our environment. Even the pace of change is so rapid now that it is unlikely that your direct descendants, your direct offspring, are going to have a very similar life as you, even in one generation, where 1,000 years ago, you were likely to have the same life as somebody who was born 1,000 years before that.
Wow. I want to
Yeah.
come back to something that you said about the DNA, right? So
Mm.
how do we best support this DNA cleanup process with all the damage that's getting done daily? How do we best support this DNA cleanup process?
Yeah. Just to kind of, I'll close the loop on this new definition, and then I want to jump to a couple of key ideas there.
Perfect.
Yeah. So we moved from this earlier definition of a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being into one that included a couple of key ideas: the ability to cope with the environment, also the fact that health serves as a resource for life. That part I think is critical, and it speaks to functioning. So it's a resource for how you function. Your health is a resource for how you function in society, and then the health that you have helps you live the life that you have as well. And there's important points that I can make on that later. That uh, health is not the only thing, and in fact, they even stated that in the '86 definition that it is also not the objective of living. That our life, the way that we have life, not to simply attend to try to manage our health, and that's important to keep in mind. And I don't know how many people here work in the health field, probably some to many who are listening, but that can be disconcerting when most of your life is dedicated to the subject, but that is also your vocation. So it realizing that who you are and what the work that you're trying to do, it takes on it is more of the objective of living because it is also your vocation. But those who you work with, it's not right. It's not just I'm going to live to be healthy, but you have to figure out like, well, I'm a lawyer, I'm a firefighter. How does my health support who I am in society now? And that could, of course, change over time as well. But that's always an interesting question to ask. And so we think about coping with the environment, resource for life, but not the sole purpose of living. And that those are key ideas. So yeah, so that's I like that definition a lot more, and I think it's more instructive and helpful because it helps you think about okay, well, if health is just the absence of disease, well, okay, then I'm fine until I'm sick. We know that's not true. Or it is this complete physical, mental physical, mental, and social well-being. Well, if I'm not living up to that, I must be unhealthy. That's not true either. But rather, it's like, all right, how well do I cope with my environment and how well do I function in my life? And then you get to calibrate your health very specifically to you and who you are and what you want to achieve. And that allows for personalization with your conception of health and what it means for you and how much time you want to dedicate to
Mind blown. I can't
it.
honestly think of a better way to start your VitaFest, but with this phenomenal interview. I mean, I have so many places I want to go with my questions. Where do you want to go next?
Well, you asked a really good question about, how do we actually improve our DNA repair processes, and that's a great question. I'll introduce a couple of terms first that are critical to health. So we talked about resilience a bit. So part of the definition is coping with the environment, which speaks to resilience. There's two terms, robustness and resilience, and it takes a little thought to consider how they're different. But robustness is essentially the ability of an organism or a system to maintain functioning in the face of challenges. So that's the key part there. Now, if you are a very robust person, it means that you could be challenged with an infection and not get sick. That's just one instance to make, you walk into a room, there's 5 people get sick because there's the presence of some sort of infectious agent and you don't, and you had an equal amount of exposure. That would speak to your robustness, but of course we could apply robustness to other ideas as well. How well can you maintain internal equilibrium in the face of different types of challenges? Resilience is your ability to bounce back after your equilibrium is thrown off, right? So you do get sick, but you actually bounce back more quickly. We can see, for example, when people are older, they might get an infection, and if that individual was 50 years younger, they would be back on their feet in a week. And if they're 89 years old, it could actually kill them. And it could either take weeks to recover, months to recover, or they might never fully recover. And it can contribute to them dying. And that's part of this robustness equation. And then, the resilience equation. So those two concepts are really key to understand, or even thinks about ways that we could identify biomarkers to measure this angle of health. And there's a key idea overall is then maintaining balance, and we know that is this concept of homeostasis, right? So that is this dynamic state where there's a variety of different terms that relate to homeostasis. And so you have things like equilibrium, balance, maintaining a steady state, or a dynamic equilibrium is good, because that is the criticisms of this idea of homeostasis, which we'll get to in a moment, have been like, well, that's not really how the body works. It doesn't just maintain some equilibrium like a thermostat would in maintaining temperature in your house. It's not static. It can move around, and there's a little bit that movement is dynamic. Overall, though, it can maintain a relative steady state over a period of time. And then there is this process of allostasis, right? This is another complementary term to homeostasis, or maintaining balance. And this is the process by which the body will respond to stressors in order to reestablish homeostasis. So you get knocked out of balance, but then the body has all of these mechanisms that can get it back into balance, right? And that is a key component to your robustness and your resilience. And then there's a really interesting idea that had been offered, which is allostatic load, which is essentially the wear and tear on the body. If you're getting constantly knocked out of your internal states, it's almost like our physiology develops little scars. The more times we do that create damage that eventually can lead to things like increased blood pressure, heart rate, all sorts of things that can, cardiovascular stressors, essentially. Immune system stressors, other sorts of stress and damage on organ systems like the kidney, et cetera, et cetera. So we have homeostasis, which is maintaining balance. We have allostasis, which is getting back into balance. We have allostatic load, which is the long-term nature of constantly getting thrown out of balance and their body shoring up energy to get back. And that can actually be damaging. And then we now have this concept of the homeodynamic space. And this is offered by I was introduced to it by a man who's now a friend, Suresh Ratan. He's a professor at Aarhus University in Denmark. And Suresh has written extensively on this, and basically there's several different mechanisms involved. To go back to your question of, well, how do we shore up our ability to handle DNA damage? Well, there's really several different um, systems for the body to handle stress. First of all, you have to be able to sort of address that stress occurred, right? The system has to register that stress occurred. Then you have to clean up the mess that any stress caused. And then you have to be able to build back to full function. And your ability to do that with perfect fidelity to get back to the zero level is part of your resilience and your robustness. It's part of your health equation. If you dealt with stressors repeatedly, but every time you only were able to get back to 98% of where you were, over time, you could imagine how that level, the total capacity of your system, would be degraded over time. And so that's key to this ability to maintain your health over time. So that's sort of a well-rounded discussion on homeostasis, allostatic load, and now this new idea of the homeodynamic space and the key components, of which the DNA damage response is part of that: perceiving stress, cleaning up the damage, and building back to your full system. That is just one of the different types of biological responses that can occur when stress happens. And so that's, hopefully that wasn't too long of an answer on there, but those are some of the key components to this, to these
No,
ideas.
this is fascinating. So Dan, from a very practical standpoint, we do have a lot of trainers and healthcare professionals looking at how healthcare professionals or trainers can work with clients or patients, and also in their own life. Like, what are the very practical things that we can do to enhance these biological processes or support our biological processes?
Yeah. So interestingly, I've talked about how stress sounds bad, right? But our bodies have evolved with a certain amount of stress as a part of our environment. And we now have a stress deficit in some ways. We have thermally controlled environments. We don't, only 22% of the United States meets the national guidelines for physical activity. Some of those adaptations that have come with modern living have been really fun. They're fine. Like, I gave a talk about hunter-gatherer sleep and whether or not, typically my bias had been, if we modify from the evolutionary conditions under which we evolved, then it's likely that we're going to experience some sort of some sort of weird, paradoxical, negative health consequence to those modern day luxuries. With sleep, that might not be the case. Or it might be. I mean, we certainly don't have enough information to say definitively, but it looks like our ability to control temperature, our ability to sleep on a comfortable bed, that has enabled deeper sleep in some regards, particularly if you're being healthy throughout the rest of the day. And that actually might lead to greater cognitive abilities. We all know the effects of not getting a good night's sleep on how we feel and think the next day. It's pretty clear. Some of it is not very clear, but definitely measurable. But generally, when we insulate ourselves from some of these stressors, then what happens is our homeodynamic space shrinks. And that means that we are less robust and less resilient. And so if we then do get challenged by some sort of stressor, our body might not handle it as much. How much stress do you need? We don't know that. So, for example, cold exposure,
Yeah.
saunas become really popular. And there's a general sense of well-being that comes with like, for example, with cold exposure after the stress. So the stress itself is uncomfortable during it. After time, when you go through a process of acclimation, and sometimes the word acclimate and adapt are used interchangeably. A pure biologist would say species adapt and individuals acclimate. I might use both interchangeably. Um, and but yeah, so you then have some level of acclimation. Like with exercise, when you go from sedentary to the minimal standard of exercise that is offered by the national guidelines, you actually have the steepest benefit. You have the most benefit per unit measure of time commitment. And then eventually you will have maximal saturation of benefit. And then there's a leveling off period, and then there might even be a decline. And that can go for really any type of stressor. It's a U-shaped curve where some is going from like none to some is usually where you have the steepest benefit. There's Bennett maximization, and then there's benefit plateau, and then there might even be a degradation in benefit. We see that with physical activity. So you have a very wide berth where you go from a little bit of physical activity to quite a bit, and you're doing quite well, and the benefits on mortality are fairly equivalent. And then eventually, if you're doing like ultra marathons, you might be accelerating the aging process by causing such a high level of damage that you're really in an allostatic load state, and that then could potentially age somebody faster because we're asking the body to spend more energy than it can reasonably offer. There's an allocation of energy to then going towards performance that might then sacrifice years of health down the road. And that's actually a key concept that we can speak to. But I'll finish on the hormesis idea. So we talked about homeostasis, maintaining balance. Hormesis, just want to distinguish here, is the adaptation in response to different types of stressors. And those stressors can include fasting, exercise, low oxygen, thermic stress, cold and hot. When you undergo various types of these healthy stressors, it does make the body more resilient and more robust. And these give us key ideas about, okay, what are the things that we can engage in that then do make us healthier? And how much do we need to? And I think that health is better spread out by doing a little bit, at least a little bit of activity or energy towards a variety of different things versus trying to overfit our efforts to becoming, hyper acclimated in one specific area. But if you had to choose, exercise is a great one. And the reason why is because exercise is far more than that. It's sun exposure. It's, you're stressing your muscles. You're outside oftentimes. It's social, right? We call it exercise, but it's actually like 5 or 6 different things that are good for you all wrapped into one. And so that's kind of how I tend to think of it, is what are our opportunities, at least from a physiological stress perspective. And then you have to then figure out that your personalized relationship to it. And we can definitely take, we're competitive by nature, some people more than others. And if somebody's doing cold exposure at 5 minutes at 42 degrees, and somebody wants to do 6 minutes at 40 degrees, right? And that cycle will continue. And there's probably limiting returns. And eventually there could be a point where you actually cause damage. Or you're acting in a way that is counterproductive. And so you have to monitor for that. There's a middle ground that tends to probably be most conducive to, like, if you're thinking like, why do I need this much performance at cold exposure? If your job or your life really merits that, you might not necessarily want to be spending 30 minutes a day in 40-degree temperatures, even though you could potentially acclimate to that, right? So you have to think about, all right, well, where's the sort of most efficient way for me to get these benefits? And then if I want to go beyond that, beyond kind of the minimal level, why do I need to do that? Is it a personal challenge? Is it just sort of competitive run awry? So you have to be thoughtful about how to do this. And this is where a good coach can come in to guide you and along that path.
So I've heard you talk about exercise, sleep, stressing ourselves with the cold exposure, sauna, all of those components of health. And what about nutrition? What is the optimal diet or nutrition?
Yeah. So I think that there is, with diet, there's probably multiple different ways that we can eat. I think that the ideal diet is almost it's an academic exercise that the general public spends far too much time on. When, for example, obviously we know the Mediterranean diet has been identified to be something that is quite good for at least permitting longevity. Sometimes we might attribute the longevity that was saw early on with that particular type of diet to that diet specifically, but all we know is that population was eating that type of diet, but it could have been other factors that enabled the longevity. That we talked about some of those earlier. But at least we can say that the diet doesn't seem to be limiting long lives. And then we have, let's say, the paleo diet, right? And that's one that I'm really favorable on. Again, conversations with Michael Rose. He's the evolutionary biologist that has done a lot of work with fruit flies, but also tested this hypothesis. And he feels that the paleo diet is likely better, particularly after in the aging period. So when you're maybe 40 and older, that the body becomes particularly well suited for the paleo diet. And I can circle back there. But generally, if you compare those two diets in clinical trials, randomized control trials where there's high levels of control, people are doing comparably well. It's about the same. There isn't a strong distinction. So the right diet for you to choose might just be the diet that you're really most motivated to do, and the one that might have some stylistic, aesthetical attraction for you. Like, oh, I really like the way they live. And if you're motivated to be a better adherent to that type of a diet for whatever reason, that might be the better diet for you than the one that you tried for 2 weeks and give up and didn't really do very well, and you didn't really want to do it. And so we have to take in other types of human factors into the discussion about diet. At the most minimal level, we know that we need essential nutrients like essential vitamins. There's conditionally essential amino acids, etc. And those have been pretty well defined. We know vitamins and minerals that the body needs, and so you want to eat a nutrient-rich diet and a protein-rich diet. There's the protein leverage hypothesis, which feels that appetite that describes how there's a component of your appetite that's determined by protein. Fiber is important for providing food for your gut microbiota. Same with phytonutrients. Your gut microbiota use those as a prebiotic as well, so you have to feed them. We know one consequence of aging is a simplification of your microbiota colony. So you actually see that the gut is interesting, right? We know it's really important, but it's so complex. It's very difficult it's easier to recognize its importance than to act really prescriptively. And so, yeah, I think in order to fully untap the potential of the gut microbiome, we're going to need a lot more data to unlock that potential. For now, I think the best ideas are just to maintain, instead of trying to micromanage your gut microbiome with certain levels of probiotics, are you helping to create conditions for your microbiome to really thrive? So a good diet should incorporate that, fiber, phytonutrients, protein, minerals, and vitamins. And then you can backtrack from there and say, what kind of foods contain that? And I've been thinking a lot recently. I've not really formulated my thoughts super tightly here, but we look at an ultra-processed food diet as probably the cause of a lot of the obesity epidemic. There's a lot of evidence that seems to be the case. We take ingredients, we purify them into basic constituents, and then build back all sorts of highly palatable food types that are offering a high reward without not the nutritional kick that usually doesn't come with it. So they're lacking in minerals, even if we put some in. They're lacking in phytonutrients. They're lower in fiber. They metabolize differently, et cetera, et cetera. Is that the destiny of constructed foods, or could we actually make far better ultra-processed foods by adding in fibers and nutrients? If we have more intelligent design, then can we actually make foods that taste great and aren't as bad for us? I think the answer is definitely yes. Like Olipop is a soda, and it has, it's sweetened with fiber, and so it has lower sugar and it has higher fiber, and so that's an example of probably a better designed soda. And now, is it perfect? No, but we could probably do better and have those types of foods be less harmful. So so that's sort of the trajectory. Is like, did they have the major constituents that enable our body to function and thrive? And then can we make things, what do people actually like and what do they find appealing? What is the cultural, aesthetical, even, logical, argument that this person finds appealing? And then can we make food products that align with that style, that enable people to have more options that suit the modern palate, that are actually like fairly healthy for us? That's my perspective on diet currently.
I love this perspective you have. I love the ability that you have to look at this concept or the subject of health and nutrition and exercise from this space that very few people that I've interviewed have this ability to do. And so I'm just so grateful that you're sharing this with the audience, because it's so refreshing. My mind has been opened and expanded in a way that feels very liberating, I have to tell you. My last question, and I mean, I wish I had 7 hours with you because I've made so many notes, but you set the perfect tone for Revitafest and everything to follow. You, and I want to close with this.
Yeah.
You said health serves as a resource for life. Health
Yes.
is not the only thing, it's not the objective of living. In
Correct.
conclusion, how can we close this interview out in a really meaningful way?
With, I think a thought that needs to get out there,
Yeah.
that we look at we look at disease as failure, and we didn't actually, just my with my ramblings, and we didn't go like really into what like a disease is and what
Yeah.
that means, and that's actually really important. But we tend to, if somebody has a disease, it almost feels like a failure. But it's interesting to think that diseases are a consequence of our abilities to extend lifespan. And so it's a trade off. In a way, it's a sign of success, particularly when those diseases don't occur when a person is, let's say, 30 years old, particularly a chronic disease. But it's like a game of whack a mole. As you get older, we have now adaptations, all sorts of adaptations in society. So, for example, glasses. If the eyes can't see properly, then we can have these orthotics that enable us to make that disease into something that is a non-issue, essentially. And if you think about what a disease is, it is a failure of a mechanism to perform a function that was designed by natural selection. So the eye was designed by natural selection to see, and it's no longer seeing with great acuity. And we put on glasses, and all of a sudden there is no issue. So do we have a disease or not? It's almost like we have to view diseases now in light of other technologies that ameliorate it or eliminate any potential suffering that would occur. And so I think that the future vision is to try to figure out ways to keep people as healthy as possible for as long as possible, which would include the modern orthotics that would be medications, surgeries, all the medical stuff, right? But in a different conception about how to use them. I mean, somewhat in some instances
Yeah.
that enable a person to have a very high quality of life, even if they are more frail than they were when they were 30. They can still have great joy in life. They can still have great purpose in life and enough energy to be able to go out there, engage socially, have hobbies and help others. And so my vision of the future is not disease free. That is probably unrealistic. And that might sound weird. And there are those working on trying to figure out ways to eliminate the damage of life, right? That while the mechanisms are so complex that drive damage, what if we just had better cleanup systems? That's exciting. That's really happening in the geroscience or aging field. And I will gladly accept all of those types of advancements as they occur, and we'll adapt to them, and they'll become a part of now how most people live. But even in the face of having diseases, is there a way to then still not feel like a failure, but a way to part of health is being able to adapt and adjust to change, and we change a lot over the lifespan. And so you want to not say, "Oh, I'm just going to give into it," but is there? In fact, sometimes you might need to run more aggressively towards these types of solutions, and instead of fearing them, And there is some narrative out there that, that drugs are bad and they're just be getting pushed on you. And I get it, because they're the incompleteness of our healthcare system has prioritized those types of treatments over ones that are designed naturally to keep you healthier overall. And there's a sort of intuitive reaction to that then makes us push away what is being pushed on us. There's something called psychological reactance, where if you try to get somebody to do something, they're going to push back. In a more complete healthcare system, we utilize every possible tool for to help an individual increase their own ability to be healthy, and to utilize modern technology when appropriate, so that their quality of life is maintained higher, or their trajectory of health declines far more slowly. And so you want to be open to everything, and you want to be knowledgeable and sensible about when and how to use it. And you don't want to be, using a crutch when you're 30 years old for the rest of your life. You only want to be using your crutches when necessary, but then use them when it's time, right? Use them to maintain your function and your ability to circumnavigate the world and be yourself. So that's, I think, kind of my perspective is like a reconception of disease is that some of it is actually a sign of successful aging. We talked about all the ways that the body will kind of degrade. And part of that goes back to something called the disposable soma theory of aging by Tom Kirkwood, is that from a genetic perspective, it makes sense for the body to have a somatic maintenance system only long enough for us to survive so that we can reproduce. The purpose of our genes is not to make us live forever. It doesn't really make sense. We're here like a flower on a plant temporarily, and then it's about giving rise to the next generation. And we're like, hey, no, I don't want to, die at 50. I want to live my life. And so we're kind of fighting against some of our biology here, and that's great. Let's see if we can win and how much we can win there. But it's also, if you have this idea that I'm never going to get a disease, and if I do, then I failed, then that might demotivate you from actually taking part in, some of the things that can help you to have a better, higher quality of life. So those are just some additional thoughts on how to see a successful aging.
Dan, this has honestly been the most fascinating conversation. I am beyond grateful that you were willing to come on as a speaker for VitaFest. You are a sensational human being, researcher, doctor. Thank you for all the wonderful things that you put out into the world. I'm so grateful.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Karen. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'm so glad you're doing this. It's going to help a lot of people, and I'm honored to be a part of it.